This is our foreign policy day as we continue to talk about the Middle East, the Yemen situation, the Gulf, John Bolton's speech yesterday, the Palestinian potential peace plan that the administration says they have called the Grand Plan, but we don't know what it is. It's the only, hey, do you know what? This is like the only thing that has not leaked out of Washington, D.C. or the White House is Jared Kushner's plan. That's because he doesn't talk to the media. So kudos to Jared Kushner and his team because they've actually kept a secret in D.C. and the White House. This is not leaked, not even a piece of it. I mean, there's got to be a model for this, right? It's like the Kushner no-leak plan. I mean, can you imagine all this time and not a single tidbit of information on the grand plan of Jared Kushner and Donald J. Trump for the Israel peace with Palestine? Not a little, even a little sliver has leaked. I don't think that's ever been done. Joining us now to really put all this in perspective and talk a little bit about what's going on in the Gulf is our good friend now, Dr. Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, and he is at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's a fellow for the Middle East and spends a lot of time on the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and he's been really our main authority there. And he's joining us now. Dr. Ulrichsen, great to have you with us, sir.
Thank you. Good morning.
Okay, so we got a whole range of things to cover. As always, lightning fast. John Bolton's speech yesterday, withdrawing from or closing the Palestinian liaison office in Washington, D.C., basically blasting the ICC, the International Criminal Court, saying it has no jurisdiction. We didn't sign it. We're not going to be beholden to what they say. He said they were unaccountable. Nobody elected them. 2/3 of the world hasn't signed up. The Senate didn't confirm it. George Bush unsigned it. We're out. What did you make of that?
Well, to begin with, what you were saying about Jared Kushner's peace plan not having leaked reminds me of President Trump before the election when he said he had a secret plan to defeat ISIS and he wouldn't tell anyone what it was because otherwise the enemy would find out and react. So this seems to be consistent with the administration's approach to Middle East policy.
Right.
For Bolton's speech, it's consistent with what he's been saying for 20 years. Back in 2000, the year before 9/11, he wrote an article for a journal that divided opinion into Americanists and globalists, and he called himself an Americanist, which meant avoiding getting disentangled in any form of international convention that might constrain U.S. action. So in that respect, it's consistent with what he's been saying for 20 years, except that perhaps until now he's never been in a position to actually put that into effect. It certainly makes it much harder to imagine a peace plan being acceptable to all sides, and it potentially increases the risk to U.S. forces all around the world. If U.S. forces are no longer going to be seen to have the protection of an international convention that the U.S. government has so publicly condemned.
Would this affect anything that was agreed to at the Geneva Convention? Obviously not technically, but morally.
Well, I think it just sends a message that if the U.S. isn't necessarily willing and prepared to abide by international conventions, then U.S. adversaries might use that against them. And it's consistent, of course, with pulling out of the Paris Accords on climate change and just with the general tenor of President Trump's approach to international affairs, which could one day be used against him by our adversaries.
Dr. Ulrichsen, let's get to the Gulf. And there's one school of thought that says, as it relates to Jared Kushner and the Palestinians, there's one school of thought that says, look, Kushner went and met with all of the Gulf states, about 2 months ago. He was in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. He met with the Emirates. He met with the Qataris. There's a school of thought that says that Kushner, whatever his plan is, that he's going to get the Gulf Arab states to back the plan when the Palestinians are at the table. Therefore, kind of it's triangulation, where President Abbas would have to say, well, I'm going to reject it even though my Arab brethren are in favor of it. On paper, that seems like, okay, that's an interesting theory to use the Gulf as leverage in Palestine. Do you see that as potential reality?
Well, I think Kushner and his team have been trying to use the Gulf partners to provide the inducements and the regional support for Abbas to push him to say yes to a deal. I don't think it's necessarily realistic, given that Abbas has a domestic constituency he needs to speak to first and foremost. And, of course, most Palestinians would probably never forgive Abbas if he signed away anything that was a kind of red line for the Palestinians. And, of course, those red lines are very deeply felt. For the Gulf rulers themselves, it's very problematic if they're now being seen as the tools to try and get Abbas to the negotiating table, because they risk being associated with a peace plan that probably, once it's revealed, will antagonize many across the Middle East. And in a sense, they may be the ones who feel the criticism most directly from their own people as well. This might especially be a problem in a country like Saudi Arabia, where feelings on the Palestinians have always run high. I mean, it's today, of course, it's September 11th, and we forget that in the immediate weeks and months before 9/11 in 2001, Crown Prince Abdullah was absolutely furious with the Bush administration over the Palestinian issue, and had threatened at some point to even review relationships with the U.S. because of his perception that President Bush was, again, losing kind of his record as an impartial negotiator. So it's going to be very difficult for the Gulf rulers to kind of explain that position to their own people if they're put into a situation where they seem to be trying to push the Palestinians to an agreement that doesn't necessarily meet with widespread support.
That makes a lot of sense. We're with Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He is a fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Dr. Ulrichsen, the Gulf crisis now, what is it, going into about 18 months, and no end in sight. I mean, there's really no end in sight. Now the Saudis are talking about putting up some kind of a crazy moat that just doesn't make any sense to any even layman like myself that have looked at a map. It seems pretty crazy. But the Trump administration, had planned to have like a Camp David Accords summit, getting the Gulf adversaries together and maybe trying to broker a way to end this thing. That got canceled. One school of thought says the Trump administration can't find a way out of this themselves. That's why they canceled the meeting. But the Qataris, even though they like to see it resolved, I mean, they've basically moved on, right? So what happens now?
Well, they've moved on in the sense they've started putting in place alternative political, economic, and trading relationships because, of course, three of their neighbors have now cut ties with them for the last 16 months. I think the administration in D.C. has only recently begun to realize just how stuck this crisis is and how little leverage they seem to have over the Saudis and Emiratis, who have resisted, I think, especially the Emiratis, have resisted all attempts to try and get them to at least sit at the same table at a head of state level with the Qataris and talk about some of the issues that clearly precipitated this crisis in the first place. You'll remember that the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, who is the effective decision maker there, refused to come to D.C. in the spring when the administration was hoping that they'd get one by one the leaders of the three countries to visit Washington to hammer out the outlines of a compromise that will be acceptable to all parties, and that never happened. What happened yesterday was that the chiefs of staff of the six Gulf countries met in Kuwait, and they're meeting today with the head of U.S. CENTCOM. And I think that they're at least trying to keep channels of communication going at lower levels. It's clearly at the head of state level that the Emiratis and Saudis don't seem to want to budge, and they continue through media outlets to kind of spin this crisis in frankly, quite absurd ways in some cases, as with the ditch that the Saudi various Saudi media personalities continue to talk about. So I think the administration has only recently realized that even though they made it very clear they want this resolved, that's not necessarily enough to get the Saudis and Emiratis to agree to back off. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they really know what to do next, to be honest.
Dr. Ulrichsen, I think you summed it up. I don't think anybody knows what to do next, and nobody is going to blink. But the other thing, and I'm going to say it again, the sense of urgency that was there with the Qataris when this first happened, right? I mean, there was a sense of urgency to get this resolved. And, of course, the demands put on them by the Saudis were just ridiculous. I mean, they were demands that could never be met, like closing down Al Jazeera and ridiculous things like that the Emir was never going to agree to. But the sense of urgency for the Qataris is not what it was, right? Even 8-9 months ago, because their trading is up, their economy is up, their GDP is up. They found different trading partners. They've opened up a new port of call. Now they're getting tourism in. They're getting cruise ships in. There's more goods on the shelves at cheaper prices. They've gotten around all this. And some people say their economy is better today than it was before the blockade. So, like this, I mean, the sense of urgency for them is gone. Am I right?
Well, it has to that extent. I mean, some of the initial urgency was also a fear in Qatar that there was going to be military action taken against them, which there is some degree of credibility that at least some sort of action may have indeed been planned.
Right.
So that was also some of the urgency. Now, yes, economically, the Qataris have been much more resilient and successful in adapting to this situation than the Saudis and Emiratis thought they would be. And of course, the demands that you talked about were really a kind of a capitulation notice to the Qataris, based on the premise that they would capitulate because they would have no alternative. But of course, the Qataris have shown over the past 16 months they have had alternatives, and they put them into place very quickly and quite successfully. GDP, I think, this year will be higher than it was in 2016, the last year before the blockade. And every move that the Qataris make to strengthen or create a new trading relationship is, in many ways, a move away from its old partnerships with neighboring Gulf states. Mm-hmm. Because the crisis, if anything, reveals to the Qataris the risk of over-relying on your immediate neighbors for trade and for access, because if and when those neighbors turn against you, you have to have alternatives. And of course, Qatar's only land border is with Saudi Arabia, which has been closed. So every relationship the Qataris now create is really going to, again, just create these alternatives that didn't exist before and make it perhaps less likely that the Saudis and Emiratis will be able to get the Qataris to, again, bow to their demands, which was never likely in the first place, but is even less likely today.
Exactly. Dr. Ulrichsen with us. Dr. Ulrichsen is an expert. He's with Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's a fellow for the Middle East and covers the Gulf in depth and the political economy of the Gulf. Let's talk about, Dr. Ulrichsen, the U.S. interest in Qatar. There's a lot of U.S. workers there, a lot of U.S. businesses there, a lot of U.S. jobs there, and vice versa, much more than in some of the other Gulf states. How does the U.S. interest in Qatar play out in this whole scenario, sir?
Well, Qatar is in many ways the nerve center of the U.S. military presence in the Gulf. You have the forward headquarters of CENTCOM, which relocated to Qatar in 2003, in part because they were made to feel unwelcome in Saudi Arabia, where they've been based since the end of the Gulf War. And their presence in Saudi Arabia was also becoming a mobilizing tool for al-Qaeda and for Osama bin Laden in the years before 9/11, of course. It's the anniversary today. So the Qatari government and relocated, got CENTCOM to relocate, and has really poured in a lot of resources to expanding the facilities that the U.S. has been able to use for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, we still see them being very active in both theaters today, 17 years later. The Qataris also, I think, have been very useful in providing the U.S. with a means of engaging indirectly with parties that the U.S. cannot necessarily talk to on a one-to-one bilateral basis. The Qataris have had success in at least bringing together representatives from warring parties in Afghanistan, in Sudan, Israel, Palestine to some extent, and in providing those channels for negotiation. We've seen recently the Taliban have engaged in discussions both with U.S. officials and, of course, also with Afghan government officials. So there's a very strong element to which Qatar furthers U.S. regional interests as well, both militarily and diplomatically. And that's, of course, not talking about the economic aspects, which clearly there are a lot of Americans living and working in Qatar, but there's also a lot of Qatari investment coming into the U.S. as well, and of course U.S. companies doing business in Qatar. So in that respect, there's a lot of interests, and that made it all the more puzzling that Donald Trump chose to react to the move against Qatar in June last year by effectively throwing the Qataris under the bus, which was so swiftly reversed by his Secretaries of State and Defense, both of whom knew firsthand the Qatari strategic and commercial value as a partner. Secretary Mattis had, of course, served in CENTCOM in Qatar for a number of years, and Secretary Tillerson, as head of ExxonMobil, was probably the one American who knew more than anyone else just how important Qatar was to U.S. interests in the region.
Dr. Ulrichsen, do you think that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, understands the ties, the U.S. interest in Qatar, say the way Secretary Tillerson did and certainly General Mattis does?
Well, I think Secretary Pompeo, as a member of Congress for Kansas, and then again after he took office initially, did seem to be more hawkish in ways that would suggest that he was more hostile to various positions the Qataris had taken. Pompeo was one of the signatories of a bill to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, I think in 2015. But he's really turned those down, and he's really, I think, been alerted to the value that the Qatari relationship brings. And it was noticeable that when he took over as Secretary of State, his appointment was welcomed by a number of Saudis and Emiratis who I think had hoped and assumed that Tillerson's replacement meant that the dispute would be now moving in their favor, but that hasn't happened. And it was actually very notable that when Pompeo made his first visit to the region, to the Gulf, in April, he took his message with him that you need to resolve this crisis, which I don't think was what the Saudis and Emiratis expected to hear from him, given his track record before he took office as Secretary of State. But as Secretary of State, I think he's been well aware that he has to represent U.S. national interests, and those interests are not served by this dispute going on.
The Trump administration, as you said, abruptly changed their position from when the crisis or the blockade first started. It seemed when they got more information, and then the last visit of the Qatari Emir Al Thani, when he came to Washington, they seemed to have gotten a good relationship and a better understanding they had when this thing started. So with the U.S. interest in Qatar, and we have the biggest base there with all the Americans we have there and the companies, what do you think the Trump administration's position is right now? Because to some of us, it's not clear.
Well, it's not clear perhaps to
or is it just me?
Many of us. I think that the Trump administration realizes that this is going to continue, this crisis, and that they need to find ways to work around it by continuing to strengthen their relationships with individual countries like Qatar, like Kuwait, like Oman, continue to encourage the 6 countries in the Gulf to meet at lower levels, not to break off all contact. And I think behind the scenes they'll be trying to sort of push Saudis and Emiratis to see if at least there's some areas where they might be prepared to engage in dialogue. But and I think the problem is that until now they haven't succeeded in finding any. And I think the Qataris have, by contrast, and the Emir said this himself in his 60 Minutes interview last September, he said if they were to move an inch towards me, I would move 1,000 miles towards them. Of course, the problem for everyone is that the Emiratis and Saudis haven't reciprocated. They haven't given the Qataris any opportunity to engage in productive dialogue. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, we're stuck.
Well, Qataris continue to move forward, and I'm going to keep the position that there's less of a sense of urgency that they have right now than the blockading countries have, because it's actually hurt the blockading country's economy, and it's has no impact. In fact, it's a positive for the Qataris. But look, no end in sight right now. Meantime, it's almost back to business as usual in a sense, because everything is, our base is still there, and U.S. interests continue to expand. The Qataris come to the U.S. They continue to invest in various things. So as far as the business economic relationship between the two countries, it's like nothing has really changed, right? It's the same.
Well, and if anything, the economy that's been hurting from it is Dubai in the UAE. Dubai's economy was really a hub for doing business in the region without any political interference, and that's taken a hit. And so if anyone suffered from this, it's been Dubai and another port in the UAE, Fujairah, which can no longer service traffic going to and from Qatar. So they've taken a hit, not necessarily the Qataris themselves. So it's kind of backfired.
Well, there you have it. Makes no sense. We're out of time. I want to really thank Dr. Kristian Coates Ulrichsen for being with us. He's a fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and he's an expert on the Gulf. Dr. Ulrichsen, as always, thank you for being with us. Great insights.
Thank you
so much.